I hate you. You're the sworn enemy of my entire kingdom. I hate you too. I'm here to assassinate you. I bet you're kind of hot under all those scarves. Why, thank you. You're not so bad yourself. Did we just become lovers? Okay, hopefully that wasn't too cringy. Hi everybody, I am a multi-genre independent author, Margot Primrose for all things romantic and swoon-worthy, and TR Slauf for all things dark, gory, and depressing. Here we talk about anything and everything affecting the book community along with writing tips and tricks, and you get my thoughts and opinions unscripted. Okay, we are continuing our Trope Talk series. Today we are covering enemies to lovers. The enemies to lovers trope was requested by Avery Moore, so sorry it took me a while to get to it, but we're finally here. Enemies to lovers is, from my understanding, the most popular trope in romance. When I started looking into it though, I found out not only is it the most popular trope in romance, it is one of the most popular tropes, period. Wowza. Considering all the different categories, all the different readers out there, all the different book genres, the fact that this trope can transcend that and be labeled the most popular trope, period, is pretty impressive. I mean, good for you, enemies to lovers. This trope has become so popular, it has entire book blogs, book YouTube channels, forums, whatever you want, dedicated to finding books that execute this storyline well so that people can share them and read more of them. It has become so popular that recently Amazon actually added it as a subcategory within the romance genre. That's pretty big. So, this category, what is it? Why is it so popular? The definition of this trope will change depending on what website you look at and what source you're looking at, but the general premise of it is going to remain the same. Two characters who start off as enemies who throughout the course of a single book or a book series have to overcome their differences, resolve their conflicts, and end up in a romantic relationship together. Sounds pretty simple, sounds pretty straightforward, and yet there seems to be a lot of discussion about whether or not this trope is ever done correctly. This trope has three main parts, right? So in order for this storyline, this romantic relationship to develop correctly throughout the story, it has to have the first part, they hate me. The second part, they love me not. And the third part, they love me. So seems pretty straightforward. I mean, most books are set up in a 3-act structure anyway, so you can just make sure each act kind of follows that part. So a big part of the enemies to lover trope is that these two characters who start off hating each other, they can be from rival kingdoms, they can be trained warriors, assassins. Those are the pretty high stakes versions of that trope. Characters need to undergo conflict resolution to reach a shared goal. And in doing that, they set aside their differences, they set aside their preconceived notions about their enemy, their prejudices. They have a very large character development when they're undergoing this change. A lot of high emotions and a lot of emotional intensity. And finally, the resolving romance. So this is really it can be a very intense journey, very emotional journey, and it's also a very nice fantasy for people to believe that yes, you can change, you can grow, and love can conquer all. It's a nice notion. I understand why people like it. It's a wonderful fantasy. It's, this idea that falling in love can change your life, your kingdom so radically that your once sworn enemy can now become your spouse or your significant other. That's a really great idea. Now we're going to get into some of the issues with the trope. So, there are forums talking about these books and sharing recommendations. I mentioned that earlier, but there's also entire forums and Reddit threads and YouTube videos dedicated to people complaining about this trope not being done correctly. What does that mean? Well, there's subtropes within this. So the most common subtropes of this is rivals to lovers. And this is also the one that people complain the most about being mislabeled as a true enemies to lovers. So what would be the difference? Well, the difference would be that rivals, the stakes are much lower than full-on enemies. So when you're talking about a paranormal or a fantasy where people are quite literally going to war and trying to kill you, the stakes are a lot higher. Or Pride and Prejudice is a really common example of enemies to lovers. Now you're probably sitting there thinking, well, they weren't at war with each other. No, they weren't. But at that time period, Elizabeth Bennet, her entire life and livelihood, and whether or not she was going to end up on the street, depended on who she married. That I think the stakes are, a lot of people argue that the stakes in that case are high enough to warrant an enemies to lovers description for that. Now, different people are going to read the same book and have different ideas. That's true no matter what. And that's part of the reason I'm doing these trope videos, because there's a lot of people who read books, end up that they decide that they don't like the trope and want to get rid of the trope completely. I don't agree with that mindset. I think any and every trope can be well written and has a place. Also, just because I don't like something doesn't mean that I want to take it away from other people. But that is different than mislabeling a book. Mislabeling a book is a bit misleading. Haha, see what I did there? It's not only is it misleading, it can cause a lot of frustration and bad feelings with your readers if you're an author and you're working on labeling the book. And from the reader perspective, you're not getting what you want. You're not getting what you were promised, and that can be a huge letdown. And if it happens enough, it can turn you off to the genre, the author, you name it. So, rivals to lovers is a subtrope of enemies to lovers, but the stakes are lower, right? And then there's also childhood best friends to enemies to lovers, basically like as you're growing up in adolescence. I think one of the common tropes for this is like bullying. I'm not a big fan of bully romance, but that is one of the ones that I see quite a bit within the romance sphere. Now, again, this trope does not have to just be a romance. It can happen in an epic fantasy. It can be a subplot within an epic fantasy or within a paranormal. I'm just talking about the romance just keeps coming up because the lovers part is a very prominent part of the trope. My brain just keeps going straight to the romance genre. Another part of this, when I was going through the conversations where people were dissatisfied with their enemies to lovers recommendations or their enemies to lovers reads, a common theme I was seeing through these complaints was that the story was missing some key elements of character development and conflict resolution. So one of the things that makes the enemies to lovers trope so well loved and so universally relatable is that you have people from different walks of life, different kingdoms, whatever it may be, who have to work together to meet a shared goal. They have to put aside their differences, put aside their prejudices, and work together. It's that conflict resolution aspect of the story element. And through that conflict resolution and through putting their differences aside, they realized that they had a lot of incorrect preconceived notions about their enemy. And in doing that, they develop as a character, they grow, and as they're growing, they realize that this person they thought they hated, they actually love. If you leave out those key elements of conflict resolution or character growth, the story is going to sound very toxic. Now, I know that the word toxic is thrown around a lot lately to the point where I feel like it's a little overused, but I don't know how else to describe it. Maybe abusive would be a good way to do it. Because here's the thing, if you don't put aside those differences, if you don't work together to meet that common goal, you still have that underlying hatred. You still have that underlying bullying and mistreating of each other. And that banter is actually not going to be playful and flirty, it's just going to be rude. No one wants to be in a relationship with someone who treats them like dirt all the time. So, if you're leaving out those elements of character development and reaching that shared goal, these people are just kind of in a hate relationship, and that's not really satisfying. It's kind of depressing. And a lot of times, when people read these books, if they're reading it for the romance part, they're reading it because they want something romantic. They want something that feels good. They want something that is an emotional journey with a happily ever after, because that, after all, is the crux of the romance genre. So if you're leaving out these key elements, you're kind of leaving your readers in the dirt. You're leaving them feeling dissatisfied and not very romanced or swooned, which is the point. Another thing is that if you don't have that good character development, they're going to continue to hold on to those prejudices and those behaviors at the beginning of the book when they were enemies. So as the book progresses, yes, even though they might start sleeping together and rage banging, they don't feel romantic. They don't feel like they've changed. They feel like they still just hate each other. They just want someone to bed, and that person happens to be there. Which, if that's what you're going for in your story, that's fine. If that's like a subplot of your epic fantasy, that's totally okay because characters are imperfect. However, I would strongly suggest that you consider not labeling it enemies to lovers. Another common complaint that I've seen about the enemies to lovers trope is that a lot of people think that any type of tension or banter should be labeled as enemies to lovers. Now, tension and banter is something that a lot of readers really like in their books. It's something a lot of people like to do in real life. They think it's fun, just kind of bickering at each other, even though it's all done with an undertone of caring. Now, if you're just bickering, that doesn't necessarily mean you're enemies. A lot of times, people do it in a fun and playful way with someone that they already care about, or just to nettle people, different strokes for different folks, right? So, if you're taking something that's just normal banter and you're labeling it as enemies to lovers, people are going to be really confused and very disappointed. For a true enemies to lovers, you need to make sure that the stakes are relatively high. Otherwise, it would just be like a rivals to lovers situation, which is fine. That's also entertaining to read and can be a very good character arc. Two people competing for the same job, two people competing in a project or some sort of a presentation or sports game, that's fine too. Rivals to lovers has just as much merit as enemies to lovers, but the stakes are very different for rivals to lovers than enemies for love to lovers. So that's one of the things that you do need to keep in mind when you are labeling your books and picking out genres. And that's also something that you should keep in mind when you're recommending books. I know it's very common now for people to have their own book blogs and bookstagrams and book YouTube channels where they recommend books based on the highlights and the tropes within the book. So that's just something to be cognizant of, is that there are some nuanced subcategories. And I do think that it gets a little bit confusing sometimes because there's not like one dictionary where all of this information is housed. Like the tropes don't really have formal definitions. There are definitions you can find across like Reader's Digest and different articles, but they're all going to slightly vary. So that can be frustrating. That can definitely be frustrating if you're trying to figure out what genre to put your books in, if you're trying to find something to recommend for someone who asks for something specific, because your idea of enemies to lovers might be different than my idea from enemies to lovers. And I think that's one of the biggest things about this specific trope is that it is extremely popular, and with the number of people reading it, you've got so many different eyes on the same books and everybody's drawing their own conclusions. Someone might read a book and say, this is the best enemies to lovers I've ever freaking read, and the other person sitting there going, these people aren't actually enemies. What are we doing here? So I think that that is one of the biggest issues with the enemies to lovers trope. Not necessarily, some people might complain that it's overused, but if it's popular, it's popular. People are going to pull it out of any book. People are going to look for it in any book. One of the biggest issues with this trope, from what I can understand and from what I'm gathering from outside sources, is that different people have different ideas of what a good enemies to lovers story is. And so that's what's causing a lot of the conflict among readers, is that someone will think, this is great, fabulous enemies to lovers. Other people are like, this is just tension. It's not actually enemies. So that is something to be mindful of when you're recommending books or you're labeling your own books. A lot of people, when they're reading enemies to lovers, they want high stakes. They want high stakes and they want these people to put aside their differences and come together to work on a unified goal. So if there's just tension, that's great, but it's not necessarily enemies to lovers. A lot of people have been complaining about this lately, where books are labeled as enemies to lovers when they really just have tension. And I do think that as an author, it can be tempting to try to be like, oh, this is really popular. Maybe I should try to market my book for this, or oh, this certain aspect is really popping right now in literature. Let me go through my books and see if I have that in my books so I can use it as marketing. It is a good business model to try to make sure that if something is popular and it is in your books, you should advertise that. That's what a good business owner would do. However, I think sometimes people get a little too excited thinking that maybe they can market their book as that when it's not truly an enemies to lovers. Either it's just tension and they're not actually enemies, or they stay enemies and they don't have any character growth and they're just banging just to bang. Again, you can have that in your book. I'm not saying don't put it in your book. I'm just saying consider how you're marketing it. What are some of your favorite enemies to lovers books? Drop the recommendations below. And in addition to that, if there's any trope that I have not covered previously that you would like me to cover in my next Trope Talk video, drop that comment below. And in addition, if there's anything writing and publishing related that you would like me to talk about, drop that comment. The volume is working, volume is working. Okay. So we're going to start with our goofy little pitch. Actually, how over the top do I want to be? Probably pretty over the top, huh? Issues. I'm gonna cut that. Why can't I get my thoughts together today? I need to blink more. I need to blink more because this is hurting my face.